Welcome to Block 38 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Wisconsin block. For this block, you will need 4 fabrics: a light, a medium, a dark, and an accent fabric. From the light fabric, cut 4 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches and 16 squares that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. From the accent fabric, cut 2 rectangles that are 1 3/4 inches by 11 inches and 8 squares that are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. From the medium fabric, cut 4 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches and 4 squares that are 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. From the dark fabric, cut 1 square that's 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches and 1 rectangle that's 2 inches by 11 inches. Now that everything is cut, it's time to start sewing. Please use 1/4 inch seam allowances unless directed otherwise. Place a light 1.5 inch square in each corner of the dark square. Sew a seam corner to corner on each of the light squares as shown. I'm using diagonal seam tape as my guide, but you can also mark lines corner to corner on the wrong side of the light fabric to be able to have a line to sew on. Make sure each of your corners is right sides together. Trim a 1/4 inch away from the sewn line on each of the corners. Press towards the triangles in the corners. This will be the center of our block. Next, we'll work on the corners of the block. With the right sides together, place the medium 3.5 inch squares onto the light 4.5 inch squares. Match raw edges on 2 of the sides and the corner, and then sew a line corner to corner on the medium square. Sew another line a 1/2 inch away from the first line closer to the corner, and then cut in between the 2 sewing lines, and you'll have a spare half square triangle block you can use in another project. Press towards the medium fabric. While I've got the iron out, I usually take a time to press the extra half square triangle blocks. That way they're ready to go. Place a light 1.5 inch square onto the medium triangle corner of the square. Sew corner to corner on the light square. Trim the seam to a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then press towards the light corner. Once pressed, these should measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Now the corners of the block are done, we will work on the side pieces in 2 different sections. With right sides together, place accent 1.5 inch squares onto 2 corners of the same side of a medium rectangle. Sew corner to corner on the accent square. Trim the seam down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press towards the accent fabric. Once pressed, these should measure 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Next, sew the dark rectangle between the two accent rectangles. Press towards the dark fabric. I did this from the back side just to make it a little bit easier. Once pressed, this strip set should measure 4.5 inches wide. Subcut the strip set into 4 sections that are 2.5 inches wide. You will end up with 4 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. With the right sides together, place a light 1.5 inch square onto 2 corners of the same side of the pieced rectangle. Sew corner to corner on each of the light squares. Trim each of these seams to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press away from the light corners. Combine these last rectangles into one unit, a square that will measure 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Press toward the medium fabric. Now it's time to lay out the block. Put the center square and the 4 corners in place. Make sure that the light triangle points to the center square. Put the sides in place, making sure that the dark fabrics touch. Using 1/4 inch seam allowances, sew the 3 rows. The seams with the light triangles should nest together. The others will be a little bit bulky. Press toward the center square and the corner squares. Only 2 more seams and our Wisconsin block is done. If pressed correctly, the seams at the corners should nest together. Sew the rows together, and once pressed, this block will measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. Press away from the center row. And just like that, block 38 is done. We hope you will remember to hit the like button. Leave a comment for us. Let us know how you're doing on your Celebrating States Block of the Month. Share with your quilting friends and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!